John Steinbeck, Chapter 1. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the Golden Foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabilan Mountains, but on the valley side, the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green, and everything spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled white recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. On the sandy bank under the trees, the leaves lie deep and so crisp that a lizard makes a great skittering if he runs among them. Rabbits come out of the brush to sit on the sand in the evening, and the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of coons, and with the spread paths of dogs from the ranches, and with the split wedge tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. There is a path through the willows and among the sycamores, a path beaten hard by boys coming down from the ranches to swim in the deep pool, and beaten hard by tramps who come warily down from the highway in the evening to jungle up near water. In front of the low horizontal limb of a giant sycamore, there's an ash pile made by many fires. The limb is worn smooth by men who have sat on it. That reminds me of that grasshopper fishing time. Evening of a hot day started with little wind to moving among the leaves. The shade climbed up the hills toward the top. On the sandbanks, the rabbits sat as quietly as little gray sculptured stones. And then from the direction of the state highway came the sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves. The rabbits hurried noiselessly for cover. A stilted heron labored up into the air and pounded downriver. For a moment, the place was lifeless, and then two men emerged from the path and came into the opening by the green pool. They had walked in single file down the path, and even in the open, one stayed behind the other. Both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats with brass buttons. Both wore black, shapeless hats, and both carried tight blanket rolls slung over their shoulders. The first man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined: small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large, pale eyes, with wide, sloping shoulders, and he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. The first man stopped short in the clearing, and the follower nearly ran over him. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat band with his forefinger and snapped the moisture off. His huge companion dropped his blankets and flung himself down and drank from the surface of the green pool, drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. The small man stepped nervously beside him. "Lenny," he said sharply, "Lenny, for God's sake, don't drink so much." Lenny continued to snort into the pool. The small man leaned over and shook him by the shoulder. "Lenny, you're gonna be sick like you was last night." Lenny dipped his whole head under, hat and all, and then sat up on the bank, and his hat dripped down his blue coat and ran down his back. "That's good," he said. "You drink some, George. You take a good big drink." He smiled happily. George unslung his bindle and dropped it gently on the bank. "I ain't sure it's good water," he said. "Looks kind of scummy." Lenny dabbled his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers so the water arose in little splashes. Rings widened across the pool to the other side and came back again. Lenny watched them go. "Look, George, look what I done." George knelt beside the pool and drank from his hand with quick scoops. "Tastes all right," he admitted. "Don't really seem to be running, though. You never ought to drink water when it ain't running, Lenny," he said hopelessly. "You'd drink out of a gutter if you was thirsty." He threw a scoop of water into his face and rubbed it about with his hand, under his chin and around the back of his neck. Then he replaced his hat, pushed himself back from the river, drew up his knees, and embraced them. Lenny, who had been watching, imitated George exactly. He pushed himself back, drew up his knees, embraced them, looked over to George to see whether he had it just right. He pulled his hat down a little more over his eyes, the way George's hat was. So Lenny is imitating the small guy George. George stared morosely at the water. The rims of his eyes were red with sun glare. He said angrily, "We could just as well rode clear to the ranch if that bastard bus driver knew what he was talking about. Just a little stretch down the highway," he says. "Just a little stretch. Goddamn near 4 miles. That's what it was. Didn't want to stop at the ranch gate. That's what. Too goddamn lazy to pull up. Wonder he isn't too damn good to stop at Soledad at all. Kicks us out and says, just a little stretch down the road. I bet it was more than 4 miles, damn hot day." Lenny looked timidly over to George. "George? Yeah, what you want?" Where are we going, George?" The little man jerked down at the brim of his hat and scowled over at Lenny. "So you forgot that already? Did you? I gotta tell you again, do I? Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard." "I forgot," Lenny said softly. "I tried not to forget. Honest to God, I did, George." Okay. I'll tell you again. I ain't got nothing to do. Might just as well open all my time telling you things and then you forget them. And I tell you again. "Tried and tried," said Lenny, "but it didn't do no good. I remember about the rabbits, George. The hell with the rabbits. That's all you ever can remember. Them rabbits. Okay, now you listen. And this time you got to remember so we don't get in no trouble. You remember sitting in that gutter on Howard Street and watching that blackboard? So, depression, you're migrating for work. Every possession in your life you either are wearing or you are carrying. This is just like the farm workers. That's what they're doing. Exactly what we've been talking about. Cow Pie Central. Then you sit at downtown. So you go downtown Spokane, you sit on the curb, your feet are in the gutter, and you're staring at that blackboard because the farmers would come in and they'd write on the blackboard, "Needed 5 men pick apples, 2 weeks." And you'd go and you'd say, "Can I have a ticket for the apple job?" And they'd give you a ticket and you would take that ticket to that farm and they would employ you for those 2 weeks. Maybe they'd keep you on later. Maybe they'd fire you early. Didn't really matter. And you were so desperate that you would take any paycheck they gave you. And there was no minimum wage in the 1930s. That was one of the things that came out of the Depression was minimum wage legislation.
Did you stay at the farm?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and most of them you were like sleeping on hay beds in the ranch or in the barn. Lenny's face broke into a delighted smile. "Why, sure, George. I remember that. But what did we do then? I remember some girls come by and you say, the hell with what I says. You remember about us going into Murray and Reddy's and they give us work cards and bus tickets? Oh, sure, George. I remember that now." His hands went quickly into his side coat pockets. He said gently, "George, I ain't got mine. I must have lost it." He looked down at the ground in despair. "You never had none, you crazy bastard. I got both of them here. Think I'd let you carry your own work card?" Lenny grinned with relief. I thought I put it in my side pocket." His hand went into the pocket again. George looked sharply at him. "What'd you take out of that pocket?" "Ain't a thing in my pocket," Lenny said cleverly. "I know there ain't. You got it in your hand. What you got in your hand hiding it?" "I ain't got nothing, George, honest." "Come on, give it here." Lenny held his closed hand away from George's direction. "It's only a mouse, George." "A mouse? A live mouse?" Just a dead mouse, George. I didn't kill it, honest. I found it dead." "Give it here," said George. "Aw, let me have it, George." "Give it here." Lenny's closed hand slowly obeyed. George took the mouse and threw it across the pool to the other side among the brush. "What'd you want of a dead mouse anyways?" "I could pet it with my thumb while we walked along," said Lenny. "Well, you ain't getting no mice while you walk with me. You remember where we're going now?" Lenny looked startled and then in embarrassment hid his face against his knees. "I forgot again." "Jesus Christ," George said resignedly. "Well, look, we're going to work on a ranch like the one we come from up north." "Up north?" "In Weed." "Oh, sure, I remember, in Weed." Weed, California. Remember Alec last year? That ranch we're going to is right down there about a 1/4 mile. We're going to go in and see the boss. Now, look, I'll give him the work tickets, but you ain't going to say a word. You just stand there and don't say nothing. If he finds out what a crazy bastard you are, we won't get no job. But if he sees you work before he hears you talk, we're set. You got that? Sure, George. I got it. Okay, now when we go to see the boss, what are you gonna do? I, Lenny thought. His face grew tight with thought. I ain't gonna say nothing. Just gonna stand there. Good boy, that's swell. You say that over 2-3 times so you sure won't forget it. Lenny droned to himself softly. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. Okay, said George. And you ain't gonna do no bad things like you done in weed, neither. Lenny looked puzzled. Like I done in weed? Oh, so you forgot that too, did ya? Well, I ain't gonna remind you. I fear you do it again. A light of understanding broke on Lenny's face. They've run us out of weed, he exploded triumphantly. Run us out, hell, said George disgustedly. We run. They was looking for us, but they didn't catch us. Lenny giggled happily. I didn't forget that, you bet. George lay back on the sand and crossed his hands under his head, and Lenny imitated him, raising his head to see whether he was doing it right. God, you're in a lot of trouble, said George. I could get along so easy and so nice if I didn't have you on my tail. I could live so easy and maybe have a girl. For a moment, Lenny lay quiet, and then he said hopefully, we're going to work on a ranch, George. All right, you got that. But we're going to sleep here because I got a reason. The day was going fast now. Only the tops of the Gavilan Mountains flamed with the light of the sun that had gone from the valley. A water snake slipped along the pool, its head held up like a periscope. The reeds jerked slightly in the current. Far off toward the highway, a man shouted something, and another man shouted back. The sycamore limbs rustled under a little wind that died immediately. George, why aren't we going on to the ranch and getting some supper? They got supper at the ranch. George rolled on his side. No reason at all for you. I like it here. Tomorrow we're going to go to work. I've seen thrashing machines on the way down. That means we'll be bucking grain bags, busting a gut. Tonight I'm going to lay right here and look up. I like it. Lenny got up on his knees and looked down at George. Ain't we going to have no supper? Sure we are. If you gather up some dead willow sticks, I got 3 cans of beans in my bindle. You get a fire ready, I'll give you a match, and when we can get the sticks together, then we'll heat the beans and have supper. Lenny said, I like beans with ketchup. Well, we ain't got no ketchup. You go get the wood, and don't you fool around. It'll be dark before long. Lenny lumbered to his feet and disappeared in the brush. George lay where he was and whistled softly to himself. There were sounds of splashings down the river in the direction Lenny had taken. George stopped whistling and listened. Poor bastard, he said softly, and then went on whistling again. In a moment, Lenny came crashing back through the brush. He carried one small willow stick in his hand. George sat up. All right, he said brusquely, give me the mouse. But Lenny made an elaborate pantomime of innocence. What mouse, George? Why, I got no mouse. What do you mean? Elaborate pantomime. George held out his hand. Come on, give it to me. You ain't putting nothing over. Lenny hesitated, backed away, looked wildly at the brush line as though he contemplated running for his freedom. George said coldly, you gonna give me that mouse, or do I have to sock you? Give you what, George? You know goddamn well what. I want that mouse. Lenny reluctantly reached into his pocket. His voice broke a little. I don't know why I can't keep it. It ain't nobody's mouse. I didn't steal it. I found it lying right beside the road. George's hand remained outstretched and perilously, slowly, like a terrier who doesn't want to bring the ball back to its master. Lenny approached, drew back. That's a good symbol. Just like the dog that doesn't want to bring the ball back. Put that on your assignment, guys. Drew back, approached again. George snapped his fingers sharply, and at the sound, Lenny laid the mouse in his hand. I wasn't doing nothing bad with it, George, just stroking it. Just going to read a little bit more. George stood up and threw the mouse as far as he could into the darkening brush. Then he stepped to the pool and washed his hands. You crazy fool. Don't you think I could see your feet was wet when you went across the river to get it? You heard Leonard's whimpering cry and wheeled about. Blubbering like a baby. Jesus Christ. A big guy like you? Lenny's lip quivered and tears started in his eyes. Aw, Lenny. George put his hand on Lenny's shoulder. I ain't taking it away just for meanness. That mouse ain't fresh, Lenny. And besides, you broke it petting it. You get another mouse that's fresh, and I'll let you keep it a little while. Lenny sat on the ground and hung his head dejectedly. I don't know where there's no other mouse. I remember Lady used to give 'em to me, even one she got. Every one she got. But that lady ain't here. George scoffed. Lady, huh? Don't even remember who that lady was? That was your Aunt Clara. And she stopped giving 'em to you. You always killed 'em. Lenny looked sadly up at him. They was so little, he said apologetically. I'd pet 'em, and pretty soon they bit my fingers, and I pinched their heads a little, and then they was dead, because they was so little. I wish we'd get the rabbits pretty soon, George. They ain't so little. The hell with the rabbits. And you ain't to be trusted with no live mice. And your Aunt Clara give you a rubber mouse, and you wouldn't have nothing to do with it. It wasn't no good to pet, said Lenny.